This slide combines how many towers you can see from your home with how far away you are. And so no matter how far away you are, there was always a difference between homes with a lot of transmitters visible and few transmitters visible. And so this is also something we expected, but we saw very clear differences when we put the data together. Now, to do biological monitoring, I mentioned that each participant collected a urine sample at the beginning of the study period and then on the final night, basically on the first and third nights of their participation. To measure melatonin, we looked at the urinary metabolite, 6-hydroxymelatonin sulfate, or also known as 6-OHMS. Measured these using a very sensitive and specific radioimmunoassay. Estrogen was measured using an enzyme assay. The estrogen metabolite is known as E1G. Okay, so you'll see that. So why did we study these two hormones? Melatonin has been associated with changes after exposure to EMF. Some of my initial studies looked at melatonin in response to 60 hertz power line exposure. So the first study I did was in electric utility workers. We saw changes in melatonin. So why would anybody care about melatonin? It's a hormone that your brain produces. It produces it on a very regular 24-hour cycle. Melatonin has some very interesting properties. It is anti-carcinogenic. It protects, if you put it in a petri dish with brain cancer, with breast cancer cells or other types of cancer cells, it'll stop their growth. It'll stimulate the immune system. A healthy, robust immune system is important for fighting and reducing the potential growth of tumors in your body. It also has other effects on the reproductive system. And so melatonin inhibits the production of estrogen. There's good literature on this. So why is that important? Estrogen is directly related to breast cancer. The more estrogen a woman produces over her lifetime, and the more is basically associated with an increased risk for breast cancer. Breast cancer is the most frequently diagnosed cancer among women. And so a number of studies have shown that elevated estrogen is a risk factor for breast cancer. This is true even in postmenopausal women. Postmenopausal women, ovaries stop producing estrogen, but they still produce small amounts of estrogen through their adrenal glands. There have been several cohort studies where they've looked at this longitudinally and shown that elevated estrogen is a predictor of breast cancer. So getting back to my previous slide then, if melatonin can reduce estrogen, then melatonin is probably protective for breast cancer. And so there's evidence for that in the literature. We were able to show this in women on Lookout Mountain. These 1, 2, and 3 represent breaking women up into groups, into thirds, based on their overnight melatonin production. And so these women had the highest amount of melatonin, and they had the lowest amount of estrogen production, estrogen metabolite excretion. And so it shows that there's this inverse relationship. So it more or less confirms what we've already hypothesized, is that melatonin can be protective. It can reduce the amount of estrogen that women produce. There have been several studies now that show that women, postmenopausal women with low levels of estrogen have lower breast cancer risks. And they've done studies now with melatonin to see if melatonin is protective for breast cancer. And elevated melatonin levels have been shown to protect against the development of breast cancer. So this relationship between estrogen and melatonin is an important one for this cancer, since it's the most common one in women. Melatonin has all these, a lot of other anti-carcinogenic effects. I'm not going to go through all of this because of time limitations. But suffice it to say that this is what I just said. Elevated melatonin levels are protective for breast cancer. And to the extent now that melatonin they're starting to look at it as a therapeutic agent to reduce breast cancer risks in women. The other thing that I mentioned was that melatonin can stimulate your immune system. We saw evidence for this also in our Lookout Mountain women. If you look at women with the highest levels of melatonin, they also had an increase in total lymphocytes, total T cells, and NK cells. So these are all different types of immune cells, showing that the higher their melatonin, the better the more immune white blood cells they had in their system at the time we measured it. All right, so these are the findings that we published just last year or in 2007 on the association between melatonin and estrogen metabolites and exposure to RF. And so here we've grouped people based on their RF exposure. And you can see we used the average RF levels that we measured in the home. We used how close they were to the transmitters, how visible the transmitters were, and this is their 60 hertz ELF exposures. And so the first row represents their melatonin metabolite concentrations adjusted for a variety of confounding factors. The E1G represents their estrogen metabolite concentrations with increasing levels of exposure to RF. And so you can see with the melatonin metabolite, just looking at the first row here, the first two rows, as the RF exposures increased in the homes, you saw a slight decrease in the melatonin metabolite concentrations. It was not statistically significant. Here, with the estrogen metabolite, there's a steady increase in estrogen metabolite excretion with increasing RF exposure that was statistically significant. And we see the same pattern no matter what RF exposure parameter we use. So the closer they were to the towers, the more visible the towers were, we found the same increase in estrogen. This is postmenopausal women only. Premenopausal women, we saw no effect of RF on E1G. And really not a real strong effect of RF on melatonin. I'll get to that in a second. But one of the things we did is we wanted to know if among women who had low melatonin, for whatever reason, were they more susceptible to the effects of RF on estrogen production? And so this graph shows women with low levels of overnight melatonin production and high levels of overnight melatonin production. And it's the relationship between estrogen and RF. And so the dark blue bars represent women who are in the highest RF exposure category, and they had an increase in estrogen. So there is a clear increase in estrogen metabolite excretion that is associated with RF exposure, occurring primarily in women with low melatonin. And we really don't see much of an association. It's not statistically significant in any case among women with high melatonin. So if we look, this is using RF, the average RF levels within the home as the exposure measure. This is using proximity to the RF transmitters. So these women here with the dark blue bars were very close, living very close to the RF transmitters, and they had elevated estrogen again, primarily only among women with low melatonin metabolite excretion. And really, women with high melatonin, not much of an association. So this shows an interaction between RF levels and melatonin and the production of estrogen in women on Lookout Mountain. So we published this, just like I said, in 2007. Happy to provide a copy of that paper. Just email me and I can send you a PDF of that. So